First speaker from the government side today, Daniel Camaro.
Mr. Speaker, as we get closer to the year 2020 and to actually realize Vision 2020, I think it is important that Malaysia take a big step in improving our economy so that Vision 2020 will actually be achieved. So, Mr. Speaker, coming on side government, we think that Malaysia should actually sign TPPA, Mr. Speaker. Why do we say this? What is the stance of the government? We think that signing TPPA will actually help improve the economy of Malaysia, Mr. Speaker. So now, what am I going to do today as the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker? First of all, I'm going to introduce to you 3 points, Mr. Speaker, which is number 1, the misconceptions related to the TPPA. Number 2, the free trade drives competition. And then number 3, I'll tell you how free trade actually increase the access to higher quality, lower price goods. And later on, Tharma will give you another 2 points, Mr. Speaker, which is number 1, free trade promotes fairness. And number 2, the future of Malaysia's economy. Now, Mr. Speaker, before I move on into my points, let me introduce to you what TPPA is. So basically, TPPA is a free trade agreement done by the US with 12 other countries, mainly in Asia, Mr. Speaker. It is actually a free trade agreement which is not ruled by the majority, meaning that this agreement is something which is negotiated between US and the 12 other countries in which they are going to agree to, and then this agreement will only be achieved after both sides actually agree to the clauses of TPPA. Sit down after my first point. So basically, how is this different from any other like a free trade agreement? We say that there is actually no difference between TPPA and other free trade agreements that have been happening throughout world history, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that it is such a bad thing, Mr. Speaker, which leads me to my first point, which is the misconceptions related to TPPA. Sit down, both of you. Now, Mr. Speaker, the first misconception that a lot of people have about TPPA is their lack of transparency. People feel that the lack of transparency makes TPPA seems like a very dodgy agreement, that they don't want the public to know. But we have to realize that this lack of transparency is not something which is new, Mr. Speaker. We see a lot of free trade agreement which initially in the negotiating process, Mr. Speaker, is being done in private. It's not released to the public. Sit down, both of you. But later on, after an agreement has been agreed on, as in both parties actually agrees what the clauses of the agreement is, they will actually release it to the public. Let me give you an example, Mr. Speaker. We see that for the China, Japan and South Korea free trade agreement, which is being negotiated in 2012. At the initial stage in 2012, they did not release any of the clauses to the public. But later on in March 2013, after the main clauses have actually been discussed, they released it to the public, and now they're still in discussion of the minor clauses of that agreement. Sit down. Now, Mr. Speaker, we think that it is important that they have this secrecy, not secrecy, but the lack of transparency at the initial stage, because it is important that the decision of the negotiators are not swayed by emotional people that sees it only as a negative side. Before I move on to my second point, yes, one of you.
So the issue isn't really about the transparency. Yes, some secrecy is important, but the extent of the secrecy of the TPPA to the point that we know nothing about it until it is leaked by journalists and other papers is just disturbing.
Well, it's not something that wasn't actually leaked at all. In fact, there are certain things that people know about TPPA, which leads me to my next point, still on the first point, like another level of it. So a lot of people think that US is using TPPA as a way to impose the will of US on these countries, Speaker, which means that only US will benefit. But we have to realize that TPPA is a negotiation, Speaker. Until both countries actually agree on the clauses, only then will TPPA be signed. And then another issue that people brings up is the issue of the IP law, the intellectual property law, because once TPPA is signed, that means that US that means that other countries have to pay the prime price towards US in order for them to create a generic product, Mr. Speaker. But we think that this is not an issue because let's see, for example, New Zealand and Australia. A lot of people, a lot of taxpayers are actually pressuring the parliamentary representative to actually not agree on this clause, Mr. Speaker, which means that if there is enough pressure for them to actually, not agree on one clause, then it is okay. They can negotiate to it, sign the TPPA without the clause that, is too damaging to one party. Now, moving on to my second point, which is free trade drives competitiveness. We think that Malaysia have been too comfortable with where they are right now, Mr. Speaker. We think that there is a lack of influx of foreign companies, lack of influx of foreign companies that can actually drive competition in Malaysia. We think that it is healthy for Malaysia to have more international company coming in so that we can actually improve the quality of product that Malaysia produces. Sit down. Mr. Speaker, we see that despite all the grants that the government have actually given in Malaysia, we see that there is a big leap in R&D in research and development in Malaysia. We see that in 2010, the R&D in Malaysia is only 0.64% of GDP, whereas in Japan it is 3.4%, in Singapore it's 2.52%, and in Korea it's 3.36%. We see that Malaysia is being too comfortable at where it is right now, and it is time we actually sign this agreement so that other countries would actually come in Malaysia and have Malaysia being pressured to actually improve the quality of their product, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we also see like how in Vietnam, after they signed the bilateral agreement with US in 2001, the GDP have been increasing by at least 6.5% every year, Mr. Speaker. And what happened during 2008 financial crisis, Mr. Speaker? We see that Malaysia, after that in 2009, was running on a negative GDP increase, Mr. Speaker. But Vietnam, who actually signed a bilateral agreement with the US, Mr. Speaker, was running on a positive GDP, which means that this is something which is good, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, side opposition might come up and say that, oh, if there's a competition, then the smaller industries would actually be affected. Now, Mr. Speaker, if the government think it is important to actually protect these industries, Mr. Speaker, they will then, agree to a clause in which, a protection of smaller industries in Malaysia is being implemented so that they are not going to be affected as much, Mr. Speaker. Now, on to my last point, which is free trade increases access to higher quality, lower price goods. We have to think about the consumers as well, Mr. Speaker. We think that it is important that consumers actually have access to high quality goods with lower price. For example, let's say in the automotive industry, we know about the issue of AP, the automobile permit in Malaysia, Mr. Speaker. Every import cars or vehicles from outside Malaysia, the Malaysian consumers have to pay a high price because of AP. But once TPPA is being signed, Mr. Speaker, we think that Malaysian consumer would actually be able to enjoy these vehicles at a much lower price. And we think this is very healthy for the people, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, finally, before I sit down, what is the burden of proof that we put on side opposition? Opposition has to prove to you how TPPA is actually different from any other free trade agreement. They have to prove to you why free trade is bad, and third of all, they have to prove to you how TPPA will harm our economy. With that, I rest my case.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel Camaro. Now I would like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition side, Mr. Amin Sarif.
Hello. Mr. Speaker, my job today for you is very simple. My job today is to cast doubt within the minds of everyone regarding a free trade agreement that is so secretive, that we know nothing about, that things that we do know about would be detrimental to the economy, and I'll elaborate this later in my points. But firstly, straight to my rebuttals from the Prime Minister. Now, he came up to to the table, and he told you about the greatness of free trade. In his speech, he talked about R&D, he talked about bringing more foreign corporations, he talked about Vietnam, and later in his speech, he talked about how lower price goods are good for people in general. We agree with that. We don't think foreign trade is bad, ladies and gentlemen. We took Econ 101, we know, we're not going to deny Smith and Krugman and everyone. So, free trade is good. What we think is bad is the TPPA, ladies and gentlemen. So, what we're going to propose to you is we're going to propose that instead of signing the TPPA, we're going to sign the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Econ Partnership. That's more ASEAN-centric rather than US-centric. And we think this is far more feasible, far more beneficial, and far better for the Malaysian economy than signing the TPPA. And this is even proven in his in the Prime Minister's point. The Prime Minister's main point was that there is no difference between other free trade agreements and the TPPA. We don't think that's the case. We think TPPA is very different, not in that its content is different, but in that the participants informing its people is different. In this, it's secrecy. We don't like the secrecy part, ladies and gentlemen. And this lack of transparency is a big reason why we oppose the TPPA. We don't want to get into something we don't know what the repercussions are. So, firstly, he told you about how lack of transparency isn't bad. He told you about examples of like some Japan and Korean free trade agreement or something. No, we think that, okay, so yes, some secrecy is important. We acknowledge that. We acknowledge that you can't tell the people, can't tell everyone in the world everything about everything a state does. However, it is as I raised in my POI earlier, it is disturbing the level of secrecy of the TPA. We know absolutely nothing about it. We don't know what we're getting into. All we know is from leaks. And what do we know from leaks? We know that patents will be extended, which will raise medicine prices. What we do know is that it will protect businesses, it will allow businesses to sue governments that introduce legislation that protects environment, something that is very detrimental to a country like Malaysia that has multiple rainforests and things and requires the environment for so many other things. But my second speaker will talk to you more about this. But regarding my POI, well, I asked the Prime Minister a simple question. This level of secrecy of the TPPA is disturbing. And what he didn't answer my question at all. He merely sorted it away and continued talking. So, and then he talked to you about IP laws and how IP laws, how he said they're not an issue. We don't think that this is the case because we think that the IP laws will introduce lengthen patents and will increase the price of medicines. We think that for a country that has really good healthcare, this will also be a big deal. Also, he talks to you about how he wants to protect SMEs. We think that this very notion actually contradicts the TPPA. We think that the TPPA will be detrimental to SMEs, to small, medium enterprises, and we don't think that the TPPA will be good for this. So, done with the battles, what I'm going to talk to you about is the unfair competition that will be entailed from the TPPA and how the RCEP is a far more better alternative. And my second speaker will talk to you about how the TPPA protects foreign businesses too much and how RCEP has better regional understanding. But before that, yes, sir.
Sir, Malaysia is going to be part of the Asian Economic Community. We've already signed.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Sorry.
Malaysia is going to be a part of the Asian Economic Community in this year, and we've signed multiple bilateral agreements with multiple countries. So tell us, why is it that we can't sign RCEP and also TPPA?
No, I'm not saying that you can't sign both. I'm saying you shouldn't sign both. Why? Because the RCEP is a far better alternative. The TPPA which I'm going to talk about, has unfair competition, which because of its partners are very different. Well, it's a good segue to my point, really. The unfair competition, ladies and gentlemen. So what we'll have to do now is we'll have to compete with countries like the US, Australia, and New Zealand. The US and Australia mainly because they're not in the RCEP. What does this mean? Well, because of the technological difference, the technological advantage that the US has and Australia has over us, especially considering that they are also big producers of steel and for the automotive industry and also for rice in the rice industry, we think this would be harmful for the Malaysian economy for a country that's so dependent on steel and rice. We think that what this signing TPPA will lead to is the flooding of goods into Malaysian markets that will lead to harming the local producers. We pointed the example of Mexico when they signed NAFTA, ladies and gentlemen. What happened was Mexico was flooded with US corn that was subsidized by the US government, and this absolutely destroyed the Mexican economy because they were so dependent on corn. We don't want this to happen in Malaysia. We think that the unfair competition, the different levels of technological advancement is very bad for in this case. Why we think the RCEP is better is because the RCEP is a regional free trade agreement, which we think regional free trade agreements are generally better than free trade agreements that are global. We point to you the example of the WTO, and when they tried to implement a free trade agreement for the WTO, what happened was they became factions. Factions started forming. Factions from the US, and we think the same factions might happen within the TPPA itself. US, and because of it's so all-encapsulating and global, because members of the TPPA are from US to Chile to New Zealand to Australia to Malaysia to Thailand, all around the world. So it's hard to negate the fact that there is a possibility that factions might occur and that nothing will get done, just as it happened in the WTO foreign trade agreements discussions. We also pointed to how the RCEP is more in line with Malaysian foreign policy that is becoming increasingly pro-ASEAN. We point to examples of how people are now suggesting a one time zone for all of ASEAN, and the 2015 promise of a regional ASEAN economy. We think that this is more in line with, not only more in line with Malaysian foreign policy, but also that what Fikri will talk to you about is that it's better in terms of there's more regional understanding. So, but the main concern, ladies and gentlemen, is the lack of transparency. We think that this is a really, really big issue. Why? Because no other foreign trade agreement that is so global, that is so big, that on the scale of the TPPA, has this much secrecy. We think that even if a bilateral agreement might have a little secrecy, a global free trade agreement having so much secrecy is even more disturbing, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that the lack of information that we have on it, and the possibility of factions occurring, and the possibility of flooding markets in Malaysian economy that will ruin the small medium enterprises that are so dependent on rice, on steel prices. We think this is bad, ladies and gentlemen, and we beg to oppose.
Thank you. I call upon the second speaker for the government, Mr. Thamalingam Pillai.
Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition speech screams to me of the kind of anti-American fear that's rather irrational. What a side government advocates is not just judge the deal agreement with who exactly initiates the agreement, but whether or not judge it by the merits of the agreement itself. What is Malaysia going to benefit, and how is it that we've seen other ASEAN countries such as Vietnam benefit from agreements with America? That's exactly what government is advocating: rationality over irrationality. But here's the thing that they have to show to us: how TPP will essentially harm our economy and cause our economy and our GDP or whichever standard that they use will cause us to regress. And that's really what we haven't heard from them yet. I have two arguments for you today. One is how free trade promotes fairness within Malaysia itself, and second, I'll talk to you about Malaysia's economic future and how TPPA helps us to progress towards that. But first, before I move to that, I have a couple of rebuttals to make about the case coming from side opposition. Firstly, about his concerns about level of secrecy. Well, I think leader opposition pointed it out very well that because it's a deal of global proportions, and because you have so many stakeholders involved, that's why there has to be such a level of secrecy. Because imagine if you are a negotiator trying to discuss that deal, and you have multiple parties, multiple groups who are trying to lobby lobby the governments within these 12 countries, within this dozen of countries, which will make this agreement increasingly more complex and extremely difficult to actually make it extremely difficult to actually come up with a final agreement. And that's essentially why we have to have secrecy, at least until most of the major points have been hashed out, and where economic experts from a lot of these countries are able to see the pros and cons of their positions. And that's why the secrecy is so important. Please sit down. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, he told us this about the problem with IP laws, and basically what we hear is just plain fear-mongering. The reality is that governments who are involved in this deal have the ability and have the power to say no if certain agreements or certain clauses within the TPPA is harmful towards their economy and towards their citizens. And as they pointed out, if the harm is so great, any economic expert or any negotiator that's involved with the dealing would say no to it. I give you an example. For example, New Zealand is advocating for its dairy industry. America wants to try to protect its dairy industry. So you have a certain element of trying to protect key industries and trying to protect their citizens, even within the TPPA itself. So we don't think this is a free for all this deal. It's mainly dealing with key industries and trying to improve trade dealing within these countries. But third, ladies and gentlemen, the idea of the RCEP. The problem with their speech is that they haven't really clarified to us why is it exactly that Malaysia cannot be involved in multiple trade agreements with multiple partners and try to gain benefit and more global control and economic leverage by having more partnerships. They cited technological advantage, but that didn't stop Vietnam from developing. In 2009 and basically from 2001, Vietnam has been having an extremely positive growth in terms of the economy. But they've been dealing with really, really big countries with technological advantages. Yet they've been progressing. The poverty in Vietnam has been decreasing substantially in the last 15 years or so. So we don't think that their fears are rational and justified. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, they gave us this example of NAFTA. We think there's a big difference between Mexico, who was pretty desperate when they signed NAFTA, and Malaysia, who has not only relative stability right now, we also have a huge group of people who are also trying to find the best deals. So we're not alone in this. We have a community of countries who are trying to find the best way to negotiate with the US. So their fears are unjustified. Before I move on to my arguments, any POIs?
Sir, the issue isn't my fear with the US. We already have free trade agreements with Australia, US and New Zealand. The issue isn't really about the free trade as per se. The issue is with TPPA by itself.
So if we already have agreements with all these big countries, Australia, New Zealand and all that, but yet you say you shouldn't join TPPA and join RCEP, you're sort of contradicting your speech just now. But let me move on, ladies and gentlemen. I have two arguments. The first is how free trade promotes fairness. When everyone follows the same rule-based system, the idea of competition, there's less opportunity for cronyism or the ability of participating nations to skew trade advantages towards favored parties. And we see that happening especially in Malaysia. We have massive amount of taxpayer money, billions of dollars, being pumped into certain industries to protect them against foreigners at the cost of Malaysian citizens, where we are forced to pay a premium price for certain products, especially for automobiles. And we think that free trade essentially, by opening it up and creating more competition, it promotes fairness. And especially, and we think when we look at other developing nations and how free trade has affected them, investors, especially foreign investors, will look for competitive companies. And this is how it will help small and medium enterprises. Those small and medium enterprises that might not be favored by the Malaysian government, but foreign investors might see a certain quality in the product of these small and medium enterprises. And that's essentially where foreign investment and opening up the economy might be extremely useful in developing the Malaysian economy. And essentially, what we have right now, in the absence of such a competitive system, bigger and better connected industries and companies can acquire unfair advantages, and we want to try to stop that from happening. But second point, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the Malaysian economic future has already been gearing towards better regional and global integration. The ASEAN Economic Community, for example, is the goal of regional economic integration actually by this year. So when you have a lot of countries which have a lot of different types of niche specialties, Singapore has a lot of technological advantages, Indonesia with a lot of natural resources advantages, and also in terms of labor forces, we think that Malaysia has already been gearing up our economy towards being more competitive and better able to compete and also push ourselves to be better or at least equal with a lot of these countries. The TPPA is just another phase in achieving that target of better global and regional integration. It creates better opportunities for Malaysian companies. It creates better outlets for Malaysian companies to get investments, and it makes Malaysia a better target for foreign investors to invest a lot of money into it. Essentially, ladies and gentlemen, this debate is an extremely clear one. On one side, you have the opposition who's talking about rather unbased concerns. One concerns that yes, it might be valid, but any economic negotiator or anyone who wants the best for the Malaysian public would say no to this kind of early clauses in the TPPA which might be harmful. And that's how negotiations happen. We develop and we try to find a middle ground so that it's best for all the parties involved. So that's what side government is advocating over here. Let's stop the fear-mongering and let's move on for the sake of a better Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tamanipandilai. I call upon the second speaker from the opposition side, Mr. Repeat yourself.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. So why are we even debating this motion, whether we should sign the TPPA or not? Well, the government has presented a good case saying that we have to sign the TPPA. Daniel has came up and said that the opposition towards the TPPA are just misconceptions, and once clarified, we would all generally agree with the signing of TPPA. And he says that TPPA encourages competition, so that's one, competition, and it promotes high quality and also lower price goods in Malaysia, while Tharma has said that TPPA will bring around fairness in Malaysia, will encourage fairness, and also that the future of the economy in Malaysia help to propel the Malaysian economy towards greater integration in the ASEAN region. That's all good. That's all the points that we on the opposition actually agrees upon. The problem is, we don't think that TPPA is the best agreement that should be signed to reach these objectives. We think that the counter-proposal that Zarif has brought upon during his speech was that we have an alternative. We have the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that covers all these objectives that has been mentioned by the government. And also, Tharma has questioned us a good question that says that why can't we sign just both agreements? Well, we're saying that we can, but we shouldn't. Why? Because there are problems, shady problems with the TPPA that doesn't exist in the RCEP. For example, the shadiness of TPPA. Daniel denied this, but we all know from media reports and everything that the government has been hesitant in releasing the details of the full details of the TPPA negotiation clauses. And while the RCP, there's no mentioning of any untransparency or shadiness. And the RCEP also covers the RCP is an agreement signed by the 10 members of the ASEAN member countries, also including 6 additional countries. So obviously it involves the cooperation of all the member countries of the ASEAN region, bringing to greater regional integration. TPPA doesn't involve all single ASEAN member countries. So in terms of bringing Malaysia towards greater economic ASEAN economic integration, RCEP is better in that sense. And before that, I would just like to bring it to the government that we have a UN economist by the name of Rashmi Banga that says that Malaysia would lose out in the future in the long term by signing TPPA, because while export increases, import increases faster. So Econ 101, import increases faster than export. Malaysia's net trade balance will turn towards from positive to a negative trade balance. Yes, go on.
Yes, since we're still in a negotiating process, let's say all those shady negotiations can shady clauses can actually be neglected out. Are you agreeing with TPPA then?
We recognize what the government sees the benefits of TPPA can offer, but we are saying that TPPA has a lot of negative things to offer, and RCEP can bring the same benefits, but negating the harms that TPPA brings. Now, it's 3 minutes and 30 seconds, so I should move on to the points, I guess. Hold on. Okay, so Daniel talks about some rebuttals. So Daniel talks about how the misconception towards the TPPA because of the lack of transparency. So we would love to rebut it by saying that the government came out here and said that all free trade agreements basically lack transparency because national interest requires secrecy. But what I like to say is, what I will say is that all the other free trade agreements that we have signed before this didn't require the negotiations to be extended up till 3 years, since 2012-2015, and it doesn't cause opposition. Like in Malaysia itself, we have 60 different groups that oppose the TPPA, and we don't have that degree of opposition coming when we were signing other trade agreements. So that's why we are scared of the shadiness of the TPPA. And in terms of competition, how TPPA can bring about better competition, that's Daniel's point too, and how he says that because more foreign companies that enter Malaysia will bring about better competition. Well, RCEP already provides that. And even without TPPA now, private investment in Malaysia right now stands as of 2015 is at 57% and is expected to propel to 80% in 2020. So their claim that TPPA alone can bring that vital influx of foreign companies to increase competition is invalid. And now moving on to my points. So my first point for today is that we don't want to sign TPPA. We will not prioritize TPPA. We will prioritize RCEP instead because it doesn't overprotect foreign businesses like the TPPA. So, for example, in this year's 2015 Asian People's Forum, a professor from UKM by the name of Dr. Philip Thoron is motioning a climate change motion that takes care of the region's environment because of the recent floods and haze. So the TPPA doesn't cover such extra economic well-being of the region. The RCEP does. The Asian community does. So we don't only care for businesses and the trade and economy. We care about the region's environment and. Even in the US, just to highlight how the TPPA doesn't care about other things other than the economy, in the US, opposition groups towards the TPPA are opposing the TPPA, signing of TPPA because there's a fear of large corporations that will be empowered by the TPPA can bypass national laws. So this is a scary